Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies and Center for the Study of Developing Societies, I extend a warm welcome to you all to the 17th Giri Deshinka Memorial Lecture. This lecture is being jointly hosted by the CSDS and ICS with the print as the media partner. This annual lecture began in 2001 as a tribute to the work and contribution of one of the India's leading China experts, Giri Deshinka. He was an exceptional scholar on history of China and India. Today's lecture throws light on deep and historically rooted issue, subject that remains central to the understanding of both historical and contemporary realities. The theme is class inequality in China and India in historical perspective, implications in a changing world. It is my privilege to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Vamsi Vakulabharanam, co-director of the Asian Political Economy Program and Associate Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His current research focuses on inequality in India and China and the political economy of Indian cities through the axis of gender, caste, class, and religion. He was awarded the Amartya Sen Award in 2013 by the Indian Council of Social Science Research. I also extend a heartfelt welcome to Professor Uberoi, Professor Patricia Uberoi, who is an Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. She is a renowned sociologist whose works span family, kinship, gender, and popular culture in India and China. On this dais, we also have Professor Alka Acharya, Director, ICS, and Professor Avadhendra Sharan, who is the Director of CSDS. I extend a warm welcome to all of them. Keeping rules for the smooth conduct of the session. Please keep your mobile phones on silent mode during the event. And the lecture will also be followed by a brief discussion and an open Q&A. We request you to hold your questions until the end and raise your hand during the Q&A. Without further delay, I hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Uberoi.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And it's absolutely wonderful to see so many people here tonight in honor of Giri Deshinka and in support of CSDS and ICS. Professor Sharan, Professor Acharya, and our honored guest speaker. I'm really honored to be in the chair and utterly unworthy for this role. And in fact, it's not the first time that I've chaired a Giri Deshinka lecture. The last one by Kamal Sheel, I also had the privilege of chairing. But this one is especially challenging, I must say, because although I've tried very hard, I am not able to pronounce the speaker's second name.
Vamsi is fine.
So, again?
Vamsi is fine.
Oh, Vamsi, okay. Professor Vamsi, that's lovely, because I've been rehearsing and I don't think I can do it. Anyhow, we're very grateful to have him here. And he comes from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I don't know why he's here. That is the most beautiful campus. And in that part of the world now, it's just about to be fall. It is incredibly beautiful and intellectually enlivening place to be. However, we are very grateful that you came here. Now, I should say something about Giri Deshinka, I suppose, and a personal note. My first contact with him was remote contact. I was a junior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Simla, and I was, as someone with a China studies background, I was feeling a bit isolated, but very encouraged by the support I was given by Dr. Niharanjan Rai, Professor Niharanjan Rai, if anyone knows of him, a famous social historian and very broad-minded person. So he asked me to join the faculty there, even though my background was in China studies. No one else's was. But I soon had a sense of loneliness and isolation. And then I chanced upon China Report, which then didn't look like it does now. It was a bit of a rag, and but it existed. So I wrote a cautious letter to the editor, who was Mr. Giri Deshinka. And I got a nice reply, and he said, well, yes, we're here. Come and see us. Come and see us when you come to Delhi. And, what would you like to do? Why don't you do a book review for us? So I said, all right, I'll do that. So there I was. And sooner or later, I came to know Giri very well personally. We came down to Delhi, and we visited quite often when he was editing China Report from premises in Haley Road, just near the just round the corner from where we were then sort of meeting. So I realized quickly that Giri and I shared some sort of background, because both of us had a bit of a smearing of the SOAS effect, which is a rather sinological sort of China studies. But somehow or other, Giri moved into becoming an expert on defense in particular, and defense studies. I think he had a science background, is that right? So, but he was a wonderful writer. So China Report was in Haley Road. Insa at Sabru House was just down the road. And we began the meetings of the seed of ICS on the lawns there of Sabru House. Now, Giri, as I remember him, and many people would relate to this, he was quite a combination of opposites. He was quite stern sometimes. He was intolerant of people who thought a lot of themselves. He was he hated pompous people, but he was very kind, very generous, and always very loving to his friends and those who needed a help to take a step up. He was a wonderful editor. His language was absolutely perfect. His eye for detail was impeccable. He was a brilliant cook, a really brilliant cook, as anyone knows who's enjoyed his hospitality. He was a real Epicurean. He loved eating, he loved food, he loved wine tasting. He knew his wines and drinks very well. And he was a meticulous bookkeeper and record keeper, and a very good administrator in whatever job he was taking up. One of them, of course, was director of CSDS and a supporter, well, a founder of ICS. So now the lecture to come is going to be very, very, very interesting for us. And I did slightly snigger when I first came to it, because I remembered, well, maybe 25 years ago, we had a delegation of Chinese scholars in ICS when we were in civil lines. And they said, we had a regular academic discussion. And then one of them came to me and he said, what we want to know, first of all, is how come in India there are so many millionaires and billionaires? And then I couldn't answer that, of course. I had no idea. And then his second question was, why is it that in India there are so many beauty queens? Oh, so that was the way it looked back then. Now, this lecture is going to be quite a challenge to all of us, I think. It's going to have lots and lots of tables, but it's not going to be quite like the usual league table of nation states and China versus India and all that. You'll get plenty of economic detail, of course, and in which China normally wins in most cases, and so on. Even the US, of course, is trailing and flailing behind. So it's most important that the comparison we're going to see is not just the tabular ones, what I call the league table. It's seriously informed by a political economy perspective. And that is what I think we're going to see. So with much anticipation now, we invite you to go ahead, give your talk, and lots of thanks.
We'll just begin by a few words from her.
There we are. Oh, the two directors.
Yes, we'll just
right.
briefly
Come
talk
on.
about
I hope I didn't take the words from your mouth about your lovely colleague.
No, I'll just add a few more things. Thank you very much, and let me join Professor Uberoi in welcoming everyone on behalf of CSDS. Just a couple of things about Giri. Everyone called him Giri. I barely knew him, but even I called him Giri. Nobody called him Professor Giri Deshinka, as far as I can recollect. And I am not the most qualified to speak about his academic work. I'm not even very well qualified to speak at him as a person. Ashishta obviously knows him much better. But a couple of things that I found about Giri as I was looking up his tenure as director of CSDS, which is the capacity in which I'm sitting here. And two things that struck me, which I thought I'll just add to the many other qualities that Giri had. And, he joined the center in 1978, was the director from 87 to 92. And one of the things that he did as a director was to turn out to be a great institution builder. It was in Giri's tenure that the idea of raising a corpus fund for CSDS was first mooted. And that corpus fund, thankfully, over time has grown enough for us to be able to support those kinds of academic activities for which grants are not easily available, including this lecture series. So that's been a wonderful legacy, something that started by Giri and has gone on to serve the center very well, and I'm sure others may have also benefited from his efforts in that direction. It is also in Giri's tenure that the ICS was set up to succeed the China Study Group, of which Giri had been a founding member and about which Professor Uberoi spoke. And again, something that CSDS has taken to. We have several new programs that run over decades. And it's a legacy of Giri's that's very important to recollect at a time when short-term projects seem to be the only academic work going around. So I thought I'll just add these two things of his legacy: the need for independent funding and the need for long-term commitment to academic programs that Giri seeded when he was director of CSDS, which has served us very well, and I think it was important enough in his time. It is certainly far more important today that institutions be strengthened in these ways. So I thought I'll just add those things to it.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So let me add to Snigdha's words of welcome to all of you. This is now the 17th edition of the Giri Deshinka Memorial Lectures. And as has been already announced, this is a joint endeavor joint platform of the CSDS and ICS. And Giri really united these two institutions, I think, for life. Because we, both in the CSDS and the ICS, have been the inheritors of a certain kind of a tradition of scholarship, research, and, as Avdhendraji just said, institution building. I remember as just fresh out of PhD, coming to ICS, first time joining this group of scholars, and my first interaction with Giri, he says, so you've done your PhD, I see. How would you define a scholar? I'm sort of shifting from one leg to the other. Somebody does research. Cut out all that. What is the quintessential element of a scholar? And so I kept quiet. I said, obviously, tell me. And he said, one who never stops asking questions. But that was my first interaction. It's etched in my memory, and that is what Giri symbolizes. As you said, everybody called him Giri. He symbolizes a spirit of scholarship which has, over the years, trained, inspired, and led by example many, many young researchers who have come through the ICS. The GDML has now really become a kind of a institution which symbolizes the spirit of scholarship, an ethos of research, and above all, a commitment to the promotion of public information and dissemination at the level of people. So this is something that has united both these institutions, and this is something that has inspired us, and we are very happy to have in its 17th edition. Vamsi. I wish I could take credit for the background noise. The big debate in India today is precisely inequality. I was looking at some of the writings that have been coming, two very interesting titles. I was struck by them. One is saying that India is not your inequality story. This comes up in one of the institutional papers. And one article which said, no, India is not the fourth most equal country. So there is this big debate raging in the background. I'm sure you must have read and heard some of these debates. We can't take credit for that, but it provides the perfect foil for something that you're going to tell us. I'm sure you will be taking a much more categorical position. Patricia referred to that. And I hope some of these confusions around what exactly we mean when we say inequality will be addressed. So I'm looking forward, really, and thank you very much all for coming. Back to you.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a lot about Giri as institution builder and a person who was, in that context, wise enough to get a grant and a basic funds to work on, and the real scholar that he was. So now, once again, I welcome the speaker. If you'd like to speak from the Austrian, that's right.
Thank you, Snigdha, for that generous introduction. Professor Uberoi, Professor Sharon, Professor Acharya, thanks for this invitation. I'm truly honored. I haven't read too much of Professor Giri Deshinka's work, but whatever I've read, has always been exciting. And the range of issues that he was able to engage with, that's truly exceptional. And all the personal anecdotes, they only enrich further my understanding of Professor Deshinka. So what I'll do today is talk about class and inequality in China and India in historical perspective. So it's largely drawing from a book that came out a few months ago from Oxford University Press, and some of the people that I worked with are in the audience. So the arguments largely will be derived from that book, but there'll be a few more insights and points that I'll try to bring out. There's a reason why the book ends in 2010, although it's published in 2024. After 2010, 2011, we do not have very reliable data in this country, and it's really unfortunate. And there is no comparable data series, there is no reliable data, so it had to stop in 2010. The Chinese did publish data sets which are reliable after 2010, but it's a comparative account. So I cannot continue the story after 2010, but I will be happy to speculate on what happened after 2010. So what I'll do is three things. The first thing is I'm going to present the story of class and inequality in China and India between 1950 and 2010 in a unified framework. I haven't seen too many political economy frameworks that are unified in thinking about China and India. So this is probably one of the first. And the focus here is on class, although I do not presume that class is the only way to approach inequality. You can also look at it through caste, you can look at it through gender, but one, it's a comparative project, so class was useful. Two, it's more like an entry point. It doesn't exhaust, and all the other categories are constituting the inequality that I'm going to talk about. So we could potentially discuss some of those nuances during the question and answer session. So once I present that story, the second thing I'll do is I'll present one of the many inferences that I drew in this book, which is how can this analysis help us devise a framework to understand within country inequality dynamics in any country across the world. So what are the lessons from China and India? And the third thing is more of an implication. So how did China and India alter the world economy, and how did the world economy alter China and India? So it's the dialectics of that particular process that I'll look at towards the end. So those are the three things I would like to do. But before I continue, I just wanted to respond to one of the comments that Professor Uberoi made. When I was working on this book, I visited Beijing Normal University for a month, and one of the foremost experts on Chinese inequality, Professor Li Shi, he was teaching there, and he, once when he was presenting, I asked him, you have this very interesting story on inequality, but where are the class structures? Why are you not talking about classes? So his response, I'm sure he had a reason to respond like this. He said, China doesn't have classes. So I spent a month with him. I made a presentation. I worked on the empirical details, and I showed him the class structure. And then he came to me and said, I'm happy to see a Marxist who also does empirical work. So, anyway, that's just an anecdote, so to a response to what. So let me start with the story of Indian inequality from 1951 to roughly 2010. Whatever I'm presenting here is known as the Gini coefficient for those of you who are not from economics. Gini coefficient is something that varies between 0 and 1. 0 is complete equality, 1 is complete inequality, and which means one person has all the income or wealth. 0 means everybody has the same income or wealth, and no country has either 0 or 1. The typical range of incomes, the Gini of income inequality is somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6. So that's the first point. The second point is I'm looking at consumer expenditure data for India, and several of you would have heard of Professor Mahalanobis, who set up various statistical agencies in India. He chose consumption. He thought Indians were reporting consumption data better than income data. So that's the data we have from National Sample Survey Organization. And for China, I'm going to use income. So the magnitudes, therefore, are not strictly comparable. Income tends to be more unequal compared to consumption, but the trends are broadly comparable. That's the second caveat I wanted to make. The third one is, like most countries across the world, the top groups, they're not properly sampled in these surveys. Neither the Indian survey nor the Chinese survey. It's also true for America. The top groups don't think it's important to respond to surveys. They evade. Of course, they don't want to tell the surveyors how much income they have, so it's very hard to get the top 0.1%, top 0.5%. So people do other surveys to capture, the top wealth. In fact, one of the people in the audience, Professor Jodka, and I worked on the top wealth in the Indian context over the last, 3-4 years. We did a project on that. So this is basically, so the long and short of it is that whatever story I'm actually about to narrate, is understated. The story is even deeper because, the top groups, if you add them, the story becomes even more intense, right? So it's not a problem for the overall narrative. So if you look at this particular, evolution of inequality in India from 1950s until now, until 2010, what you see broadly is inequality decline in the first 30 years. It rose a little bit in the first decade after independence. Then it declined until about 1980. And then, slowly it begins to rise. So if you look at the whole period, it's a U-shaped pattern. Inequality declines in the early stages of growth, development, and then, it begins to rise. I'll come back to this point. This is completely, in contradiction with a Nobel laureate's work, Simon Kuznets, who argued that inequality evolves in just the opposite way, inverted U. It rises during the early stages of development and then declines. So Indian experience is very different. And Chinese experience is also similar to Indian experience. And then you also have the East Asian experience after World War II, which is very similar. The only other interesting thing I want to draw your attention to here is the national inequality in India is somewhere between the rural and urban inequality. Okay, so those are the main points to see. It's a U-shaped evolution, and we'll think about the whole process of the evolution of inequality, from that standpoint. If you look at the Chinese inequality, unfortunately, during the Mao period, 1949 to 1978, they just did not, they either didn't collect data or they didn't release the data, or they didn't think it was important because, they had already achieved socialism. So inequality was not an important concern. But after 1978, they've been regularly releasing inequality data. So after that, you see that inequality begins to rise quite steeply after 1985 until about 2010, and then it stagnates. So that's the Chinese story. But if you put all the facts that we know and make an inference, between 1950 and 1980, Chinese inequality declined quite precipitously. And I'll talk about it qualitatively because we do not have data. So if you want to make an inference, it's again a U-shaped pattern of evolution in the Chinese case. The first 30 years is not, it was a socialist economic system, whereas India had a mixed ownership capitalist system. But after 1980, as you will see, there are dramatic similarities. It shocked me when I started analyzing some of the data. So the qualitative part, 1950 to 1978, there were two broad principles that drove the Chinese policy towards equality or inequality. The first is, they achieved, an extreme form of urban equality. In fact, in 1978, when they resumed the surveys, the Gini coefficient for urban China is 0.16, which is among the lowest urban inequality levels that you'll ever witness anywhere in the world, including Scandinavian countries. But the in rural areas, what happened really was they achieved within unit equality. Within communes, within villages, they created equality, but that was not sufficient to eliminate inequality in the rural areas. So the egalitarian changes, if you look at the egalitarian changes during that period, urban elites were eliminated or they fled to Taiwan or other Chinese-speaking regions. And rural elites were eliminated through land reforms between 1952 and 1955. And very, very rapidly, they were able to implement collectivization much faster than what happened in Soviet Union. There was a lot of consent for the collectivization process. And of course, apart from achieving these egalitarian changes, there was also significant emphasis on primary education. I think this is something that we all know, very different from the Indian emphasis. And then, also healthcare access, which also promoted greater equality on the whole. The institution of barefoot doctors, which is quite famous. This is something that, several of us know, peasants being trained to become doctors and so forth. So why did they have moderate inequality? That's because the inequalities between communes across different regions, that was never addressed. Mao focused on self-reliance of communes, but then, what about the differences between fertility? A very fertile region will have higher output in the commune compared to a less fertile region. So those inequalities were never addressed. So the intra-rural inequality was quite significant during the Mao period. And the second major source of inequality was the gap between rural China and urban China. That was very significant through this whole period. And through various studies that have been conducted, that gap comes out, although, we don't have macro data on this. And it also heightened during crises like Great Leap Forward or, the Great Famine or Cultural Revolution. The rural-urban gap tended to heighten. This is something that, we can infer from various studies that have been published. And there were also ideological inequalities, party versus non-party kind of inequalities. This is not necessarily economic, but, there were other kinds of status-related inequalities. If you look at the Indian story was a real surprise because when I started looking at the data, when I started looking at what happened during that period, I knew that China did a lot more in terms of egalitarian changes, but Indian inequality also declined according to all accounts during this period. I also showed you the data. But the puzzle with the Indian story is poverty remained very steady and stagnant at roughly 40% between 1950 and 1977. So if inequality declines and then poverty is fairly stagnant, how do we explain the puzzle? And that's what I started figuring out. In the first 30 years, what happened? The real story is the middle groups in India, both in rural areas and urban areas, they strengthened. And there were transfers from the top groups to the middle groups. But the really poor, and you can also read it in caste terms, they didn't achieve very high mobility during the Nehru and Indira Gandhi period. And this is the Indian story. So what are the qualitative, what are the policy explanations? In stark contrast with the Chinese, as all of us know, I'm just repeating what many of us know. The state failed to implement land redistribution, progressive land redistribution. Food shortages occurred, near famines occurred through the 50s and 60s, and they were solved through Green Revolution, as all of us know. And Vivek Chibbar's work shows this, but many other studies. Capitalist classes were significantly protected. This class grew quite strong by the 1980s. And rural small peasants, landless workers, urban informal workers were largely left out of the whole growth process or development process during the first 30 years. And primary education and health were not emphasized in the same way as the Chinese did. But at the same time, there were weak tenancy reforms, there was the creation of public sector, there was some employment created in the public sector, But two other processes, nationalization of banks in the late 60s, 1969, and then, the annexation of, through estate tax, the estates of princely rulers, erstwhile princely rulers, that made a significant difference. So there were, overall, the story is from the top to the middle, there were transfers, but not from the top to the poor or from the middle to the poor. So it's basically top to the middle. So strengthening of the middle. I feel, I would also belong to that. I'm a beneficiary of, the strengthening of the middle during that period, growing up in a small town in Andhra. So middle groups consolidated while the elites were largely protected, except the financial capital, which had banking, which had ownership of banks, and the second is the princely rulers. And by the end of this period, you also witness something very interesting, and this is a story that's been well documented as well. Many of the high growth, relatively high growth states witnessed urban elites, rural elites coming to urban spaces, so urbanizing themselves, by the end of this period, and that process continues. These are new entrants into urban elites, basically agrarian elites joining the urban process. So that's the Indian story. After 1980, we actually have rich data. We have micro data. This is again Gini coefficient. If you look at the period 1988 to 2013, 2007 is the peak. That's between 1992 and 2007 is when China implements almost ruthless neoliberal reforms. 50 million workers were retrenched from Chinese factories between 95 and 2002. And Gini jumps from 0. Gini coefficient is a very sluggish coefficient. And if it jumps by 20%, which is what happened in China during this period, it means an earthquake has occurred in that society. It's of that magnitude. And so that's what you witness, in the Chinese case. And then in the Indian case as well, inequality is roughly stagnant, but through the 1980s. 80s is a very interesting decade in both countries. Maybe we'll talk about it a little more. But after market reforms are introduced in 91, the first data point is from 93-94 for the NSS data. Until about 2004-05, the first decade of reforms, first 13-14 years of reforms, the Gini coefficient jumps by more than 10%. This is for consumption. So another earthquake has occurred. Something very big has happened in both these countries in the span of 15 to 20 years. And if you follow the story until 2009-10, inequality growth slows down after 2004-05 until 2009-10. And this is the period when, a weak welfare regime is implemented, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, various other schemes are implemented. So there's an overall welfare orientation of the regime, and inequality growth begins to slow down, during those 5-6 years. The first UPA won, and I think this is also intuitively something that we can agree with. So let me jump to, so this is the inequality story. How do we interpret it in class terms, right? Especially after 1980s, how do we interpret it in class terms? So before I tell you the class narrative, one thing that I just want to highlight, which is, nobody had used these surveys to create, to come up with class categories. So this is something that I was able to do some 15-20 years ago. And then, for Chinese class structure, I don't claim extreme expertise. I actually spent a lot of time with Chinese economists, and we came up with the class structures for China. So that's the comparison. So Indian class structure, I also learned a lot from many, great economists, on the left broadly, but for the Chinese case, it was largely statisticians who looked at inequality data, what is known as the China Household Income Project. All right, so I experimented with multiple schemes. Largely the inspiration is Marx, who produces surplus, who appropriates surplus, who gets the distributions of surplus. That's the definition of class that I deployed. But multiple class schemes are experimented with in the book. I'm presenting one of the schemes. So if you look at the income growth between 1988 and 2013, and the first bar, for each of these classes, urban elites, urban professionals, that's 1988 to 2007. That's the period of intense inequality increase in China. In the urban case, the class structures are somewhat similar for India and China. We have urban elites, that basically owners and managers, and then you have urban professional workers, and then urban skilled and unskilled workers. And then there is no differentiation among farmers because of the land reform process and collectivization process. Even after farmers were given land to cultivate and they became residual claimants after 1978, there's not too much of a differentiation in terms of land holdings. And then you have rural workers and small employers in rural areas. So the story is very clear. There are two classes that dominate, and maybe in rural areas, the village leaders and small employers, but it's the urban elite, urban owners, business owners and managers, and urban professionals. These are the two classes that achieve the highest income growth if you look at the top panel. If you look at the bottom panel, this is basically just to give you a relative picture of the inequality. So what this bottom panel gives you is, for each of these classes, I'm looking at the growth of the class mean over the population mean. Class mean, class average, what is the class income average over the whole population, and how has that ratio changed? So there are these two classes that I'm pointing to, urban elites and urban professionals. They have been the relative gainers of the whole growth process in relative terms, and all the other classes, look at urban workers, look at farmers, look at village leaders, look at rural workers, they've all witnessed relative losses. So these are in relative terms, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So the class story is extremely clear from the Chinese case. Let's look at the Indian case. Now we are looking at consumption growth. Again, there's if you look at the period between 93, 94 and 2004-5, you basically see owners and managers in the formal sector achieving very significant growth, and then you see professionals, and to some extent formal workers, and all others have very low growth rates during this period. This is also a period when India witnessed a major agrarian crisis, and the spate of farmer suicides is something that started in the late 90s, and it continues in many contexts. Again, look at the mean ratio growth to get a clearer picture. The three positive stories there, positive growth stories: owners and managers in the formal sector, professionals, and to a marginal extent formal workers. All others are negative in terms of relative gains or losses. So that's the Indian story, right? So very, very similar after 1980s. If you look at the Chinese story and the Indian story, these are the two classes. Urban owners and managers and urban professionals are driving the whole, are gaining from the whole growth process. So this is, to conclude this discussion based on data, this is a play on, I don't know how many of you have read Giovanni Arrighi, a world systems thinker. He wrote a book called Adam Smith in Beijing. So this is a response to Arrighi, although he is not alive. I met him 6 months before he died. We had a huge argument. He said Marx is not relevant for Beijing. Smith is the one that's relevant. But if you read his book, what you infer very quickly is Arrighi's story comes from 1980s China. He's not even looking carefully at 1990s. But if once you incorporate 1990s, what happened in China after 1992, what you actually see is, much of the inequality in China after 1992 is explained in class terms. So what I did is I did a regression-based decomposition. Don't worry about all the technical terms. It's just decomposing inequality using regressions. So when you do that decomposition, both in the India case as well as the Chinese case, the most important social axis that explains inequality is class. So that's what the title means. Marx in Beijing and Delhi. So it's not Smith in Beijing, Adam Smith in Beijing. It's actually Marx in Beijing, but Marx in Delhi as well. And the only caveat I have is caste categories that I use to make this regression decomposition are very broad categories that are available in surveys. These are, other castes, OBCs, SC, ST. If you take a more jati-based detailed scheme, you may get, something more interesting from, the category of caste. So to kind of move on, so what are the dominant class coalitions and what are their relationships with the state? In terms of the Chinese dynamics, release of market forces in the late 70s, early 80s was initially equalizing because, they implemented gradualist reforms, unlike Soviet Union when it was dismantled, it was shock therapy. China always implemented gradualist reforms, and they started with agriculture, and agriculture grew really rapidly, around 6%, 7% per annum, and that was really equalizing. Rural-urban gap went down, quite sharply in the early 80s. But after 1985, when they start the coastal development strategy, there is a regional inequality that emerges. There is a rural-urban gap that re-emerges, and nevertheless, through the 80s, this is the Arrighi story, labor share, the share that went to workers increased throughout the 1980s, and then it starts its decline for the next 20 years. So share of capital improved after, late 1980s and until about 2010, capital share kept on increasing. The two dominant classes that I talked about, they emerged by then, urban capitalists and professionals, and state. So this is counterintuitive, but let me still say it. We can debate. State played catch up with markets and dominant classes until 2010. It's not that Chinese state had fully figured out strategies. I think they were one step behind all the processes they had unleashed, and they were playing catch up with markets and the classes. And then now, after Xi Jinping, came to power in 2012, state has a more dominant stance, relative to these classes. But I think it's a delicate kind of balance. I was looking at the Hurun list, which is the list of billionaires, top wealth. China has the highest, dollar billionaires in the whole world. It has a higher number than America. And this is, they really saw a massive increase in this number over the last 10 years. So what about the Indian dynamics? There's a very clear dominant class coalition, urban capitalist classes and professionals. I think they are driving the logic. And rural elites, it's very clear now in most of the high growth states have urbanized themselves. So elites are no longer that keenly interested in rural areas except the land, real estate, for real estate purposes. State policy after 1991 has been largely governed by the interests of these two dominant classes, except during the 2004 to 2014 period when there was a slight, a weak welfare orientation that was introduced, not because of the benevolence of the state, but because of people's movements. You can also say class struggle. 2004, before 2004, there was a big fight, between late 90s and 2004. And the response was the introduction of the weak welfare orientation. And the elite, struck back in 2014. So after 2014, it's been a backlash of the elite. And, combined with a certain kind of nationalism. That's how, the Indian story moves forward. So to discuss the comparative political economy, there are remarkable structural similarities, 1980s, both economies had a very similar growth process led by consumption. Markets became more prominent. After 91, 92, both economies embraced ruthless neoliberal reforms with high growth, rapidly rising inequality, and both were led by investments and exports. And both economies implemented mild welfare reforms. China called it harmonious society. India called it inclusive growth under Manmohan Singh. China under Hu Jintao at that time. Inequality growth slowed, and they created mildly responsive neoliberal regimes. After 2012 and 2014 in India, it's again consumption-led slower growth, but plutocratic, as I mentioned. And both economies, this is quite remarkable. China has created a lot more employment than India, but informal sector has grown, has exploded even in the Chinese cities. About 50 to 60% of the Chinese workforce is informal today. But given the Chinese advantage by the 1980s with the workforce, equality of opportunity, infrastructure, strategic and gradual release of market forces, and a whole lot of contingencies. It's not, everything cannot be explained only through structural forces. I think there were also contingencies that played an important role in the rise of China. And they grew much faster than India with all these advantages. So let me come to the inferences and implications. First inference is what can we learn about within country inequalities, from the China and India story. What about Kuznets? I think, I already mentioned Kuznets' hypothesis is that, there's an inverted U kind of evolution. Early process of development, you see inequality rise, and then inequality declines. That's not what we witnessed in India or East Asia or China. So the anomalies that came up, that Kuznets' hypothesis came up against, are both in East Asian, the East Asian evolution of inequality, but also developed countries. It was not just inverted U. After 1970s, inequality rose in the developed countries as well, like US or UK and so forth. And what about the Piketty hypothesis? Piketty wrote this grand book called Capital in the 21st Century. It's a wonderful book empirically. I don't think he understood the meaning of capital. But he doesn't distinguish between capital and wealth. That's a really important distinction. He doesn't do that in the book. He responded to it later. But the hypothesis that Piketty has is capitalism will always witness long-term secular rise in inequality. That unless there are exogenous shocks. So he doesn't have an institutional account. He doesn't have a role for class struggle or people's movements and so on and so forth. He introduces all of that in his later work. I'm talking about Capital in the 21st Century. I think that particular account. I think theoretically there is a serious problem with that work, but empirically it's magisterial. I think it's one of the greatest accounts of inequality. So my point of departure is that there are crises, in capitalist crises and deep capitalist dynamics and regimes of capitalism, that help us understand inequality patterns much better, in countries. So I counterpose global dynamics and national dynamics, and then look at and propose a framework basically based on this study. So global dynamics are determined by deep crises in core centers of capitalism. These are crises like Great Depression, or what happened in 2008, what happened in 1970s. A crisis produces a molting process. Molting is, it sheds the existing institutions, the system, and it's done through agency, of course, and then grows new institutions, a new different institutional regime, a different set of theoretical categories. And crises over the last 150 years are oscillating between a lack of profitability, profit crisis, and crisis of demand. Great Depression is a crisis of demand. 2008 crisis is a crisis of demand. The long depression of 1873 to 1896 is a profitability crisis. 1970s is a profitability crisis. So there's an oscillation between these two. And the way capitalism has proceeded is, they try to address one crisis. When profitability crises occur, typically inequality tends to rise because, then the system oscillates towards the capitalist classes, and then, their profits are restored, which increases inequality. And then effective demand crises typically tend to create greater equality. So the Chinese, Indian, and Asian experience, if you look at Indian and East Asian economies, the pattern is U-shaped largely. Chinese economy is also U-shaped, although the first 30 years were, the inequality declined in a socialist system. And then, the global dynamics of the Keynesian Fordist regime of 1950 to 1980 was equalizing across the world, and developing countries, including Asian countries, had relative autonomy. They implemented import substitution industrialization policies. They implemented redistributive policies like land reforms, which were also equalizing. Post 1980s, this becomes disequalizing with the neoliberal regime, both the global dynamics as well as the national dynamics. So to conclude with the framework, the within-country inequality is governed by interactions of national and global political economies. Neither direction is dominant a priori. National political economy needs to be studied at the national and subnational scales. It's possible that national political economy resists the domination of global political economy, and they although typically they tend to go together largely. So the last point is basically the implication. What are the dialectics of inequality and global integration? If you look at global integration under neoliberal capitalism, it has led to higher within-country inequality across the world, in most countries across the world. And this is also true of China and India. But what has happened also is that the between-country inequality has gone down. And that's mainly because of the rise of China and India. So overall, the inequality levels have declined. Global inequality among persons across the world, that has declined. But the interesting part of the story is, especially after 1990, higher inequality in China and India has meant that they've become more and more deeply integrated in the external economies. You can call it the process of externalization. And global crisis of 2008 has only accelerated that process. It has slowed down global north significantly. So, and it has produced systematic initiatives of externalization like the Belt and Road Initiative on the part of China. And India, if you look at the Indian integration also, it has accelerated, but on a much lower scale compared to China. So, what is the nature of the world order now? If you look at the global GDP and growth over the last 250 years, dipping into Angus Madison's famous database, what you actually see is around 1700, India and China had about 50% of world's output, and then it declined to about 9% in 1950, through colonialism, through European domination in China, and then it has come back to around 25%. So there's a reascendancy of China and India in terms of growth and shares in global GDP. In terms of inequality, this is what I was saying earlier. If you look at the total inequality in the world, it has come down a little bit during the neoliberal period, but that is because the between-country inequality has come down because of the growth of China and India. And but China and India have become more unequal internally, and they're contributing to higher within country inequality. That component has risen. And in terms of exchange, between India, China, and the developed world, what you actually see is an unequal kind of an exchange. And so this is based on something called the labor terms of trade. And labor terms of trade are basically how much does one unit of domestic labor exchange for foreign labor units. So if you look at that particular exchange and look at that graph, India and China have been losing millions of worker years to developed countries. I only showed the case of the US here. And it's coming down a little bit, but it's unfavorable, unequal exchange in terms of labor terms of trade between China, India, and the US. And if you look at, this is a difficult graph to comprehend. Let me just say what is there. With less developed countries, like African countries or poorer Asian countries or Latin American countries, China and India have developed a favorable exchange in terms of labor terms of trade, and they have an unfavorable exchange with the developed countries. So somewhere they are in the middle. They're not developed, they're not underdeveloped. Both countries are in the middle. But there's been a talk about, has China become imperialist? I think there's significant externalization, but I think they're somewhere stuck between unfavorable exchange with developed world and favorable exchange, extractive relationship with the developing world. And economic engagement so far has been without political dominance. I think that's the key part of the definition of imperialism. So I wouldn't call, in fact, if you look at a lot of literature, the presence of China or India, much more China than India, has given more choices to poorer countries. So it's not just US or some European countries, but now China is also has joined the list of creditors. So right now, I don't think we can again discuss it. I don't think it's imperialist. So let me conclude the talk. If inequality dynamics continue, they'll continue to deepen externalization. I think both these countries will look to externalize even more. Both countries, instead of addressing inequality, have moved towards a plutocratic, authoritarian nationalism. The social compact of 2004 or 2005 in both these countries, after 2014, it has become unacceptable to the elites, especially in India. It's very, very clear. Elites hated, even the mild welfare orientation that was achieved during that decade. So nationalism is one answer, externalization is another answer. So instead of addressing inequality within, I think that's the direction in which they're moving. But the reascendancy of China and India is still within the European world system. I think this is something that needs to be thought through carefully. A triad, a constitutive policy triad of inequality reduction, climate mitigation, and technological innovation, they have to come together. It's a constitutive triad. It's not, piecemeal policies, and they have to come together. And if China or India, or both countries together, are able to move away from the energy-intensive European model and offer egalitarian alternatives, I think there is a possibility for global hegemony, especially of China at this point in time. But that's the real hegemony. It's not simply achieving GDP or achieving higher growth, but do we really have answers to the deep problems of the European world system? Thank you very much.
Well, I think we'll shortly open up to questions. That was an overwhelming and mind-boggling presentation. I must say, we're very privileged to be part of it. I think, just speaking as an innocent sociologist who's worked in an Institute of Economic Growth, one of the things that I do sort of recall is some of the formulae and book titles in the profession of sociology or social anthropology. A very, if you like, prominent one was Professor Andre Bette's book called Caste, Class, and Power. So here we've had the class, and the power is sort of assumed, but In India, it's the caste factor, which you slightly mentioned, but not very much. And this is the most highly contested present-day issue all over the country, from north to south, including over the question of reservations, the issue of whether to have caste censuses, and what is to become of them. So that is one factor which, of course, the Chinese have not understood what the caste system is about and why it is there and why possibly it is stronger and more politically important than ever, and what it has to do with class. Caste and class go together, and power. They are a real important triad. The other thing that you mentioned bit by bit, but the social demographers might also ask, well, what about gender? Slight mention. But you could tell a whole story from the perspective of gender over these different periods. Ethnicity, very, very important in India, but also in China, where you have ethnic minorities. In India, religion is such an important topic now. It was meant to sort of become part of the, not to become important. It is absolutely prominent in everyday life. Location also, the geography of this, the old difference between the coastal and the interior, or other geographical things that you would like to have. And of course the urban-rural one you have dealt with here in so many factors. So I think that will be something that one can throw out at this point. But this is also the point where we can have questions from the audience for clarifications. Yes. Introduce yourself and also
Thank you.
ask
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation. You mentioned consumer data and consumer trends and the income trends for China. So between these two, is there also a story about savings? Because when it comes to a correlation between inequality on the one hand and reading trends of consumption and income on the other hand, the one variable which I think has been read a lot about is savings. And there have been hypotheses about lifelong cycles of savings, so how it impacts different layers of, or how it has a variegated story to tell in terms of the class structure, because you did mention working around class structures in Beijing, in China as well. So I was wondering if you have a particular portion on savings also in your work. Thank you.
should we have a bundle of questions, or should we answer one by one? Take 3 or 4. All right. Do come ahead.
Thank you,
You
Professor.
next.
That was a very good lecture. And my question, the first one, as Professor Uberoi also mentioned, is about these regional disparities and how do you account for those both in India and China? And the second question is, where do you categorize the migrant workers in the chart that you presented? Which category is that in, and how do you account again for these migrant workers and their mobility? Thank you.
And a third question here.
That would
Namaste.
be the 4th, including you.
Namaste. I do not have a question, but I'd like to appreciate all of you, the way you carried forward the essence of Giri Deshinka, sir. I really hope and pray that this lecture gets bigger and better. And Vamsi, sir, aapka presentation, like, it was very informative. I really liked it. That's all.
So should I?
Okay. Next round. Yeah.
So I did anticipate your question, Patricia. So, I mean, the short answer is my next book project is Class and Caste. So, so I'm going to look at it both empirically and theoretically.
People think that should be the first.
So
At the moment,
the reason why,
Yeah,
there's a defense which is, class was the entry point, right? So it's not, so this book starts with class as an entry point, and it also provides a comparative axis to think about China and India. The other axis, it's not that easy to make comparisons. But I mean, in terms of explaining inequality, economic inequality, but so that's the so it's an entry point. It's not the last word on inequality. In fact, I start with that sentence. There are other social axes that are constitutive of the story that I am narrating, but they need to be brought out. That's a different project altogether. So I wanted to do the class project, partly because I returned to India. I taught at the University of Hyderabad from 2007 to 14, and what I was told repeatedly is class has no analytical power in the Indian context. So I wanted to show that that's a flawed argument. That's a flawed understanding. Class has significant analytical power. Now, if one becomes dogmatic and says class is the only category, that matters, that is a problem. But that's not my position. So and that works for gender, ethnicity, religion, spatiality. In fact, another book of ours is in the making, and there we look at gender, class, caste, and religion in Indian cities. So we do look at multiple axes, but this one was economic inequality and the analytical power of class to explain it. So let me kind of leave it there. And on the savings question, it's very clear that Indian inequalities are significantly understated because they don't account for savings. If you look at Indian income data, then the inequality levels would be much higher. I mean, there is some data from the Institute of Human Development, IHDS, that survey, which is a collaborative project between Maryland, University of Maryland, and I think Institute of Economic Growth, possibly, maybe NCAER, I think, yeah. So, but for the long-term continuity from 1951 until 2010, we had to look at consumption data. That's the reason why I do make that qualification that inequality levels are understated here. And if you do add savings, and then you are somehow able to get the top 0.1% or top 0.5%, then you will get a very, very different, even deeper story of this account that I narrated today. So that's a good point to keep in mind. And in terms of regional disparities and the story of migrants, the problem with Indian surveys, there is a survey on migration, which is very poor, I think. I worked on it. I wrote a paper using that survey. It doesn't capture a lot of footloose migrants, the kinds of people that Jan Bremen is talking about in much of his work. So they're not captured in that survey. But more long-term migrants, if that's what you have in mind, they are captured in the survey. So they're accounted for. In the Chinese case, in the first two rounds of the China Household Income Project, they didn't have a separate migrant subsample. But after 95, they created a subsample of migrants. So that's why I presented with migrants and without migrants. So you get slightly different, values of inequality.
So they're included in the urban workers category?
Yes. If you include them, then you get slightly lower levels of inequality. But if you don't, then you get slightly higher levels because then the rural-urban gap is much higher in the Chinese case. In the Indian case, we need to. That's a battle that all of us need to have with the. The country is on the move now, and if they're not able to, capture that very important space of migration, then how much can we fully trust these numbers? But so far, I think, until about 2010, migration was not as intense as it was in China. Right? After 1993-94, about 300 million people moved. Probably it's the largest internal migration that human history has witnessed. But in the Indian case, until 2010, this data is covering the story, migration is there, but it's not as significant as the Chinese case. And regional disparities, so it's already there. It's captured in the book, basically. I didn't present it here. I mean, I can't present everything. I was told to speak for about 45 minutes. Yeah. And I think so I really cut out the other stories. But all those stories are also presented in synoptic form. But I've also worked on these issues in other papers. And
yeah, just let me throw out one little question about this caste and class. We have Professor Surinder Jodhkar here, who makes his living out of telling us about this. So, is the caste system effectively also a class system in India? Tell me, what's your answer? Come on, Professor.
I have a question to ask.
Well, all right.
Answer the question.
Okay, answer the question then.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not. I mean, that's
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, I think instead of, I would suggest him later, I'll sit with him and talk about it. Instead of writing a book on caste and class, perhaps one should write a book on class and ascription. Ascription is a kind of entry point which would help you compare India and China rather than caste. I mean, caste is a kind of it has become an Indian category, though originally it was not. But my question is, in a sense, slightly related, that there is new caste of billionaires in China, and the Marxist theory would also suggest that state and class are in some sense co-constituted in capitalism. And in Indian story, we know how, in some sense, the new billionaire and the state power is, in some sense, having a honeymoon or whatever word you want to use. It's very open, it's in the public, right? Both sides are kind of supporting each other, kind of celebrating each other. How does this relationship work out in case of China, given that China is publicly still calls itself a socialist communist country? And how does it, both ways, how does state work with the growing power and influence of the billionaire? If the billionaire is there, obviously, it is not possible without state support. And how do the billionaires engage with state, including, in some sense, influencing its policies, but also culturally? Like in India, wealth is celebrated, and we've seen Ambani's wedding became a kind of, larger national story. And what does that happen? How does that happen in China? Does it come in the public sphere in any way, or it's kind of, grammar of it is very different?
My name is Ravi Bothalingam, Emeritus Fellow at ICS. Really wonderful lecture.
I think people can't hear you, Ravi. Is it on? Or?
it's on.
It's on, okay.
A really wonderful lecture, thank you. Very, very illuminating and stimulating. And that has stimulated my my question, which was triggered by your last slide, where you speculated about the future course of China and India. And your hypothesis was this depends on how they approach three issues: inequality, climate change, and technology. So my question starts from there, that does this presume that technology is neutral to the consequences in both the cases of climate change and inequality? In other words, one could argue that technology is really vital for climate change, to do it rapidly in the time available. But what is the relation between technology and inequality? Is it clear-cut? And further, is there any difference between state-led technology, as in China, and more private sector-led technology, as in India? You earlier mentioned in one of your slides that China was better at state-led development, whereas India did not do as much in the earlier years, at least. So I think I might have garbled this question slightly, but I hope you've got the drift.
I got the
Thank you.
gist, yeah.
Okay. Shall we answer that question first and then take another one? I think
So I have two questions. I
Yeah.
can take one more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go.
Sir, Professor Vaman, can you give me some clarification about political affiliation of this poverty and inequality? Like some states are being ruled by Congress or some by BJP. Do you think it's some political connection also?
I don't fully understand the question, but let me speculate on what you mean.
Excuse me, Prof. Greetings, Prof. I'll make it very quick. Firstly, thank you for that excitingly data-driven analysis of both the political economies. So I was wondering, the first class I attended of a professor in economics. The professor told me that every billionaire is a policy failure. There were professors who told me that without billionaires, we don't have growth too. So would a billionaire tax solve the problem? Is that the way forward? How do we practically implement that, strategically, pragmatically implement that? How do we ensure the capital flight doesn't take place? Also, how do we stop big tech from expanding billionaire policies? I have one more question, if I may. Is there any other socio-political economy that you adore which has tried to curb inequality to a certain extent? There are instances of Iceland, Scandinavian countries, even Japan. For all its vices, Japan is one economy that has tried its best to curb inequitability. Even France, there are slums in Paris, but the French, among all OECD countries, have the highest quantum of leisure enjoyed by every common citizen in France. That would be all. Thank you so much. So sorry.
So,
All right.
several questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we are ending. Okay. No, we can go on. I'm a teacher like many here, so I enjoy questions. So, Surinder, this is an ongoing conversation. Class and caste or class and description, I think we can continue to discuss that. But I do think that, it's important. Class is not caste. I mean, I also agree completely. But at the same time, we have to look at, how they work together. I think these are two different processes. How do they come together? How do they work together in creating, inequalities, both in the economic domain and other domains. On the billionaire question, in China, that is your question. So I think after 2001, the Communist Party accepted the wealthy into to become members of the party. And you also witnessed both at the higher levels and also at the township and village enterprises or urban enterprise levels, you see a lot of party members becoming business people. So there's a significant nexus between wealth making and the Communist Party. I think this is something that was established from 1990s onwards. So this is not new, and that has only deepened. What has probably happened after Xi Jinping came to power, one of the things, there are many things that are happening. It's a very interesting, last 13, 14 years. But one of the interesting things that has happened is he's also trying to create a credibility for the party, for party rule. So there have been renewed attacks on corruption, for instance, without necessarily changing anything in the economic policy. So I think China continues to be neoliberal in its economic orientation, but there are these attempts to create more credibility. So there are for instance even very wealthy people are scrutinized by the state about the corruption practices and so forth. But I don't think they're trying to change the policy of creating top wealth in China. I haven't seen any evidence of that. And culturally, one of the things I've noticed in all my visits to China is markets. In the sphere of markets, in the domain of markets, that is where freedom is expressed in China, right? I mean, politically there are, let's say, more constraints than you see in the US or India. So if it comes to the display of wealth or display of certain new mores, cultural mores, I don't think there is any significant constraint. So there is conspicuous consumption. People know about it, and it's quite it's obvious, for observers who don't even know the language. When you go there, you can see that these cultures are not discouraged. They're actually out in the open, and people are witnessing those cultures. Ravi, so that's a very tough question. I end the book with that question. So the reason why I end the book with that question, with the triad, the constitutive triad, and that is something that all of us have to think about. The energy-intensive European model, which worked for small populations, relatively small populations that existed in Europe and US and European offshoots, other European offshoots, we have imported that into China and India now. And we have 1/3 of the world's population, and we are much bigger than Europe, US, and their offshoots. So it's not going to work. I think, so when I say technological innovation, are there innovations that we can make beyond the European model? I mean, China is implementing a lot of solar technology, renewable energy systems are being taken seriously there. More than India, more than the Indian case. But I think are those measures enough, given the numbers that we have in both these countries? So what I'm basically proposing there is, how do we devise technologies? I'm basically saying technologies are not neutral. There is no technological neutrality. I think we need to look at our own needs. We need to rethink our own context. And then we need to develop technologies that are appropriate for these two contexts and get off this whole growth game. I mean, I'm not saying people should starve. I think, we should feed our population. We should improve consumption levels. But I think, in a way that where we don't follow the European model, I don't think that is going to take us anywhere. What it does is it creates precisely the structure that I showed. A small elite in both countries will live like Americans, and the rest of the population will be deeply deprived. And I think, the elite population is going to cause, serious damage to climate, serious, and they'll heighten inequality. So it's a deep rethink that I'm asking for. So thanks for catching that point. I think it's really, really important that, a lot of different groups of people rethink, this get together and they rethink. And how do we get off the European world system? If we, Arigi's whole point was, within that world system, China may emerge as the next hegemon. But why should we stay within that world system? I think, we need to move out of that European world system and rethink, how to steer the world forward. And that, I feel, is true hegemony, if China or India can achieve it. China is definitely more dominant at this point in time compared to India, globally in terms of their impact. But I think they're still hanging by the coattails of the Europeans. They haven't really broken free of that influence. That is my interpretation. And what was the last question? So the political affiliation, I'm not making any claim like that Congress states are better or BJP states are better. But I'm definitely making a claim that there was a responsive somewhat weakly responsive neoliberalism that was created between 2004 and 2014, where economic policies continued to create inequalities, but a mild welfare orientation was also introduced during that decade. And it happened to be during the UPA period, UPA 1 and UPA 2. So this is not at the state level, this is at the national level. And I certainly think, the period prior to that and the period after that have not witnessed a similar kind of efflorescence of even weak welfare orientation. So that is my reading. So it's not at the state level, at the national level, I would broadly make that point. Would a billionaire tax be a solution? I think we shouldn't have billionaires. It's it's really pathological. It's sick that countries like China and India. China has 814 billionaires according to Hurun list. What business do they have? I don't think we need to rethink. We need to rethink. China has to rediscover egalitarianism. Communist Party in China has to reconceptualize and rediscover egalitarianism. At some point, Deng Xiaoping said, "Let some people get rich." I think many people got rich now. Time to rethink. Let us. I think the Communist Party, they're very, very well trained in Marxism. They're very, very capable people. They're very, very deep in their understanding of the country. I think it's time they rediscover egalitarianism. And I think both countries ought to devise, it's more than a billionaire tax. I think, we need to restructure our economies in a way that do not create billionaires, but, that cater largely to, that bring down inequalities without, just using the category of taxation, right? So in that sense, I'm not, if they want to leave, let them leave. They're not going to hurt the majority. Anyway, they're not helping the majority of the two countries. So if they want to leave, they'll leave. If you want to use billionaire tax as a short-term measure, I think the states ought to go ahead and do that without the fear of losing the billionaires. Who is going to lose? I mean, they will lose, if they lose access to this large pool of workers from whom they have been extracting, value. So examples to curb inequality, this is the point I was making in the framework that I offered. There have been successful, periods where capitalism has been curbed, like, the period between 1945 and 1973. Some people call it the golden age of capitalism. Where welfare policies were introduced, greater equality was created, middle classes strengthened, expanded. But that is the whole point about capitalism. As soon as there was a profitability crisis, right, by late 60s, early 70s, which was heightened by the oil price hike, the OPEC countries acting together in concert to increase oil prices. The regime went back to, taking away many of those rights. I mean, there was free education in New York City, where I live, until 1970s. They just, in one policy move, they completely cancelled public, free education in the City University of New York in 1976, when the City of New York almost went bankrupt. They went to Wall Street. And Wall Street people said, get rid of all these welfare systems. Why are you supporting the unions? Why are you giving free education? You get rid of all that, then, we'll give you a loan. We'll buy the city bonds. So I think it's the rhythms of capitalism that really institute inequality dynamics. That is the point I was making. And particular regimes of capitalism create particular kinds of inequality dynamics. So you can't, unless you are able to question the fundamental dynamics of capitalism itself and think of alternatives, I think the patterns of inequality are also going to oscillate as long as you are within that system. So that probably gives you a deeper answer than what you expected. Yeah.
Well, There was just one final question been waiting to be asked. Can you bring the...
Out of my 4 visits to China,
just a
I'm
minute,
very
take a minute.
happy that you have, you're writing your next book on caste and class, because, and also that you visited BNU, Beijing National University, where the head and dean of the Department of Comparative Education had invited me to make a keynote speech in 2002. Now, after the lecture, they requested me to go to one of the postgraduate classes, and they said, please enter the class, and they'd love to talk to you from India. So, one of the questions with the students, they said, Professor, we are very concerned about caste and class. Which class would you belong to? Class. Okay. Where would you classify yourself? In which class? So I said, well, professionally, I'm a professor. I won't be in the elite class. I'll be in the middle class, medium. So they said, all right. And caste? I said, caste may be high, but my class is medium. So they didn't understand that. So then they said, but Professor, our professors don't get the salaries. We heard Indian professors get a lot of salary, much higher than in China. So where would that be? That means they would be lower class? So I said, you're getting me into a country. I don't understand your kind of a thing, but I'm telling you what we are. Professionally, I'm middle class. If you take the income-wise, there are billionaires who are the elite, who are considered in India the elite. And VIPs, politicians, are considered elite. They said, well, India is a bit confusing for us. You have too many of these sorting out. So these are the interesting questions. 2002, the students were thinking in their mind, which class? And if India, and they were really comparing India and China all the time.
Well, that's a very interesting reminiscence, I must say. I think we have to wind up now with many thanks to the speaker, to the audience for great questions. And unfortunately, the problem of the beauty queens hasn't been solved. Before we finally wind up with a vote of thanks, we need to give you a little memorial gift from ICS. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And we only wish that Giri Deshinka could have been here to put his teeth into it rather nicely.
Thank you so much.
Alka, would the two directors like to say?
No, there is a vote of
Okay.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for your patience, and to Professor Vakulabharanam for such an informative presentation today. It is both an honor and a responsibility to extend the vote of thanks at the conclusion of this evening's lecture, held in memory of Professor Giri Shukla, a figure whose life, work, and values continue to inspire all of us, many of us who never knew him. As has already been mentioned by Professors Uberoi, Acharya, and Sharan, the contributions of Professor Deshinka transcend the boundaries of academics, impacting lives and having a lasting legacy for decades to come. In keeping with tradition, the 17th Giri Deshinka Memorial Lecture explored a highly relevant and timely subject, and the speaker examined in great detail the historical trajectories of class inequality in China and in India, and reflected on the broader implications within an evolving global order. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi, it is my honor to offer our deepest gratitude to Dr. Vamsi Vakulabharanam. Dr. Vakulabharanam adeptly encapsulated oft overlooked intricacies of class inequality in both China and India, offering new insights into the subject with sharp analytical precision. All of us here today shall leave with more to think about and more to discuss. I would also like to extend our gratitude to Professor Patricia Uberoi, whose remarks and comments laid the groundwork for this evening's lecture, and whose expert moderation made for a highly engaging and informative lecture. Professor Avadhendra Sharan from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, whose constant support and cooperation and unwavering dedication toward carrying on the legacy of Professor Deshinka was instrumental in organizing and facilitating the smooth conduct of this evening's lecture. We are highly grateful to Professor Sharan and the entire team at CSDS. We are also highly grateful to ThePrint for being a media partner for the 17th GDML, to the management at the India International Center for ensuring the flawless organization of this lecture, and for all their support in terms of logistics, we offer our sincerest gratitude. To Professor Acharya, who has consistently guided those of us at ICS, and to all the young researchers who make up Team ICS, for their hard work and efforts spanning days, hours, and weeks. Thank you so much. Finally, one would be remiss if not to acknowledge the engagement, contribution, and participation of all members of the audience. Your thought-provoking questions and comments stand as testament to the emergence and growth of new discourses. Thank you so much for being here tonight, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.